Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dominique Gomez from the Salazar Center for North American Conservation at Colorado State University. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar series, Connecting for Conservation. And today we are very excited to talk about land conservation at scale with our two wonderful panelists, Dr. Rebecca Shaw and Heath Nero, and a little bit more on them and from them in just a second. First, I want to just cover a little bit of brief housekeeping. All attendees are on mute, so we can't hear you, but we would love to hear your questions. So please submit your questions and comments through that control panel question box on your right-hand side. We will get to as many questions as we possibly can during the moderated Q&A following the two short presentations. This session is being recorded, and we will share it within the next couple days. So we know that many of you will want to be able to share it with your colleagues or come back and reference it. So we'll get that out very quickly. We also want to invite you to learn more about the Salazar Center online at salazarcenter.colorado.state.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or Facebook, and you can learn about our work. And the Salazar Center is committed to working on the health and resilience of natural systems and human communities, and particularly on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we recognize that the conservation and environmental movement have often failed to live up to those values. And I think that it would be remiss to not mention, especially this week, how important that is, that we really think a healthy natural environment is important for the health and wellness of all people. And we have a lot of work to do in the conservation community to make sure that we are taking justice and equity seriously. It will mean really big changes, and we think it's more than time. And we know that the work that our two panelists do today is so important in making sure we have that healthy environment for everyone. And we are very excited to talk about this topic. With that, I want to introduce our first wonderful panelist, Rebecca Shaw. And Rebecca is the Chief Scientist and Senior Vice President at World Wildlife Fund. And she works with many staff and partners around the world to identify the most important scientific questions that challenge their mission and advance solutions to those challenges. She came to WWF from the Environmental Defense Fund, where she was responsible for developing and implementing the vision and strategy of land, water, and wildlife programs. And she is a lead author on the section of the 2014 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fifth Assessment Report that focuses on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And she serves as a member of the California Climate Adaptation Advisory Board. She holds an MA in Environmental Policy and a PhD in Energy and Resources from the University of California in Berkeley. And Rebecca, we are just so excited to have you join us today. Thank you so much in advance for your time and for all your work that you do on this topic.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak to you. I want to just make sure you can see my screen before I go on any further. So just somebody give me a nod.
Looks great, Rebecca. Yep, go ahead.
Okay. Terrific. Thank you again so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm Rebecca Shaw. I'm the Chief Scientist at WWF. And just for those of you that don't know, WWF is based in 100 countries globally, including the US, where we work to conserve nature and for people. And so a lot of my conversation with you is not going to be about WWF today, but be about the science of conservation and why nature and the health of nature matters so much now at this critical time in our history. Conservation, as many of you know, has its roots in the protection and stewardship of lands and waters for an array of human benefits. And really, the science in the last 50 years has been focused on protecting biodiversity for the benefits for human. Conservation science really led the development of methodologies to do this kind of protection systematically to protect species and habitat diversity. And we have a whole lot of planning methods on how to do that. And often early in the years, we were thinking of nature as something you could protect and set aside. But things are really changing. So, yes, please.
Rebecca, so sorry to interrupt you. It looks like we can no longer see your screen here. Sorry about that.
No problem.
There we go. I hope everyone that fixed it for everyone. Yep, now we can see it again. Thank you.
You can see it again? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, let me just make sure. Oops, I am advancing without, here, okay, good. I'm back. Sorry about
Wonderful.
that. But we do know that things are changing really fast as we have left the Holocene and entered the era of the Anthropocene, from climate change to all the other kind of changes that are happening in landscapes and seascapes across the world. We are developing a growing understanding of our dependencies on nature. So today I'd like to talk to you about what does the best available science say today about the state of nature, and what are the implications of that for conservation, and how does conservation science then and its implementation evolve to the changing state of nature. One thing that you may or may not know about that I have found incredibly exciting, last year, there was a comprehensive, the first really comprehensive assessment of the state of nature in May of 2019, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So it's a science body from experts around the world who took 5 years to publish an assessment based on peer-reviewed literature to really give us the best possible understanding of the state of nature and the human dependencies on nature. Their findings were that the rate of global change in nature during the past 50 years is unprecedented in human history, differing in its regions and different countries, and across different kinds of systems, terrestrial systems versus aquatic systems and marine system, but still very dramatic. So I just want to quickly run you through some of these key findings because they're so important for how we think about conservation and landscape conservation moving forward. First of all, they found that natural ecosystems have declined by 40% on average relative to their early states. This means 47% reduction in ecosystem extent and condition, 30% reduction in terrestrial habitat integrity, largely caused by habitat loss and degradation. 75% of terrestrial and 66% of marine environments are severely altered by human actions, creating a condition under which we are not able to reap the benefits of those systems as we had in the past. And 85% of wetlands have been lost. So that's just the ecological integrity, the state of the ecosystems. But if you look at a component of the ecosystems in terms of species, approximately 25% of species are already threatened with extinction in most animal and plant groups. Human actions are affecting vertebrates like this one, the golden finch from Australia, like never before. And the global rate of species extinction is already at least 10 to 100 times higher than average rate over the past 10 million years. And we are expecting that if these trends continue, that we will see the extinction of nearly 1 million out of the 8 million known species in the coming decades. We also see declines in ecological communities, so how these species interact in these ecosystems and those benefits that they provide. And we see an 82% decline in the global biomass of wild animals. And the interesting thing is we now have more domesticated vertebrates on Earth, so livestock, by weight than we do wild animals. Today, the biomass of livestock, which is dominated by cattle and pigs, far surpasses the biomass of wild animals. And that's true on the bird side as well. Poultry livestock is twice as much as the biomass we have in wild birds. So we see this shift, not only the form it takes, but also in the mass it takes and the kind of energy flows that we have on the Earth's surface. There's also been a change in the way we understand the way we own or don't own and steward lands and waters. Many indigenous peoples and local communities across the planet live off of lands and waters, sometimes in much more sustainable ways than the rest of us. Waters and their resources and in ways that lead to their protective status, even though the land does not have protected area status. We do know now that we are learning from the ways in which these lands and waters are managed from indigenous peoples and local communities. And we've seen that if these areas are included in our global understanding of how the systems function and what we count as protected areas, we may be able to include those lands and waters under protection, include these under the estimates of those under protection, and it made more than double what we have under protection today. So that led the scientists in the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services to come to terms with the fact that we really need to be not just looking at biodiversity in the way we have traditionally looked at it in terms of in conservation. So biodiversity and nature has been long thought to be the number of species and their diversity and their interactions among themselves, but also to really look at the flows that come from that biodiversity to people, all the contributions of nature to the quality of life of humans, individuals, societies, and humanity as a whole, material, non-material, and regulating. And while these are kind of wonky terms, it's intuitive what nature delivers to us, not just the aesthetic value of species, but the underlying values that support livelihoods and our well-being. In the material, you have energy, food, genetic resources, learning and inspiration, and other types of services. People call these ecosystem services. The new term is nature's contributions to people, but it is the same thing. In the non-material, there's also energy and food and feed. And in the regulating, we have this area that's really, really important, such as pollination, the regulation of air quality, the regulation of water quality, of climate, the regulation of ocean acidification, regulation of freshwater and coastal water quality, and the regulation of hazards and extreme events. I don't think I have to tell you how important we understand these things to be for our health and well-being, and how much the decline of nature impacts these things. So let's just go quickly. Let's go back to where we started with respect to protected areas. When we started early on, conservation has its roots in protecting lands, waters, and species at many scales. And protected areas are just a clearly defined geographical space dedicated and managed for long-term conservation of nature and ecosystem services. If entire systems are transforming, freshwater, terrestrial, and marine, what is conservation today with the direct and indirect drivers of nature accelerating, such as habitat conversion, climate change, and species? So we have looked and responded to this over time, and we've been making protected areas, making many more of them, and we've been connecting them, and we're making them bigger in those connections to account for some of these changes we see happening on the landscape and to make them more resilient over time. And certainly we've seen this in some of our protected areas systems, like in the Amazon. Some of the greatest protected area systems in the Amazon for a whole host of reasons, not just biodiversity protection, but also for human health and well-being. And if you come back out from the Amazon to the globe, you can see how the Amazon stands out when taking a global view of protected areas. This map just shows you terrestrial protected areas in green. These are special categories of lands that are set aside either for species conservation or for other kinds of ecosystem services. And the blue dots are those marine systems. thus far, 15% of terrestrial and freshwater environments have been sit in protected areas as they're legally defined. 7% of marine marine realm is in protected area. Clearly, if nature underpins human health and well-being, as the UN panel is telling us, we will have to do more in the future. And that more has taken the form of a bunch of different really interesting proposals for what we need to do. E.O. Wilson talked about Half Earth in his book and started a Half Earth project to think about protecting Half Earth. So if we are now at 17% in terrestrial ecosystems and 7% in marine systems, we're looking at a big chunk of land and waters more to protect. Nature Needs Half is also talking about protecting half Earth, but is explicit that we need to protect half of the Earth by 2030, and that we should do it in a distributed way across the landscape. And then there's the much more grounded 30 by 30, which is taking many forms. So that's protect 30% of the lands and waters by 2030. And that is really much more bottom-up process that is being defined country by country in order to allow for the kinds of flexibility folks are going to need in order to protect what's most important to them culturally and with respect to their own values. One thing that is being, as I talked about earlier, that is really being looked at hard right now are this thing called other effective area-based conservation. And that is not just the areas we call protected areas, but those areas that are overseen by local communities, private entities, and indigenous groups that serve the function of protected areas. And it turns out if we count those all globally, so you see here in the map of the Western US, we have protected areas in green. The blue represents possible other effective conservation measures to protect ecosystem services and biodiversity. You can see we might be able to expand what we consider as conserved very easily. Some are even saying it could double the current protected areas in both terrestrial and marine lands if you just look at things that are being managed effectively for conservation outcomes. And if you go back to nature's contributions to people, there are a lot of lands and waters that are being considered, that are not considered protected, that are actually being managed for outputs that people actually need in global for their daily lives. That includes water flow, mitigating nitrogen pollution, really looking at pollination and so on. And so that there is a lot of good science at very minute scales telling us about what we need within our communities to conserve and to underpin human health and well-being. And we also see that climate changes are really having radical effects across the globe. And so when we look at all three of these, we need to really think about then, how are we going to combine if protected areas deliver climate regulation, deliver all these other ecosystem services, delivered species contributions, how do we really think about our array of policy tools and our array of mechanisms to protect and manage Earth in a way that underpins our health and well-being into the future and into our children's future? And so we're really looking now at a global level, Sustainable Development Goals, the Convention on Biological Diversity Goals, and the Paris Agreements to see how we align all three of these for the implementation of a whole Earth. So finally then, I'll just stop here and say that it is my estimate, or my team's estimate, that we probably need a lot more than 50% of the Earth in order to sustain a stable climate and underscore human health and well-being and access to nutritious food. But it's how we manage it and how we think about managing it from the bottom up, community to community across the globe, that's going to be critically important for us to be able to have a stable and thriving environment in the future. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heath.
Rebecca, thank you so much. I think that was just a wonderful beginning to the conversation, some great grounding in the background of the science. Let's see here and make sure everyone can see my screen here. And I think a really great start to the conversation with Heath and what he will share in terms of his work on the 30 by 30 and work at the Wyss Foundation. And with that, I want to introduce our next panelist. Heath Nero is the Conservation Program Officer in charge of global conservation at the Wyss Foundation. He manages all the Foundation's conservation grant making, including the Wyss Campaign for Nature, a global effort launched in October of 2018 to help protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030, building right off of what Dr. Rebecca Shaw talked about. Before joining the Wyss Foundation, he served as a combat engineer officer in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and served a one-year combat tour in Iraq during 2003-2004, for which he received the Bronze Star. And after leaving the Army, he worked for the Wilderness Society in the Bureau of Land Management Action Center. He has a BS in Civil Engineering from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and a Master's in Science and Environmental Policy from the University of Michigan. Heath, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm excited to have you join on and add on to this conversation.
Great, thank you. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can. I will certainly let you know if there's any issues, but it looks good.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Dominique, and thank you to Rebecca as well. Normally, when I give a presentation like this, I have to spend about half of my time convincing folks that we have a biodiversity crisis. So I think she did a wonderful job of teeing this up and to have a discussion about how much of the Earth should be protected. So like Dominique said, I'm the Conservation Program Officer at the Wyss Foundation. We're an endowed foundation based out of Washington, D.C. Fortunately, I'm one of the lucky few who gets to work out of our Durango, Colorado office. We have about a little over 20 employees, and we have two main programs. One is social justice, where we do work on empowering women, providing economic opportunities for our citizenry, etc. But I head up the conservation program, and that's what I'll focus on today. So a little bit about who we are. We were founded in 1998 by Swiss entrepreneur Hans-Jörg Wyss. Hans-Jörg, in the 1950s, after himself earning a civil engineering degree and being a combat engineer in the Swiss Army, came over to the United States and attended Harvard Business School. And during the summer between his 2 years, he came out to Colorado and worked for the Colorado Highway Department, and just fell in love with the West and was just amazed by how we have all these public lands out here that you can go on free of charge, go wherever you want, and said that if he ever made a bunch of money, he would love to help save some of it. He assigned the Gates Pledge to give away half of his fortune. And like I said, in 1998, he founded the Wyss Foundation. And at the time, we were only working in the Intermountain Western United States. In fact, when I joined the foundation 11 years ago, back in 2009, we were still only working pretty much in the Intermountain West. Since then, we have grown significantly and now work in a bunch of countries, which I'll touch on later. We give about $100 million a year away in the conservation program. When I started here, the endowment was smaller than that. So that gives you some idea of the sense of scale of how we've grown over the last 11 years. We are a by invitation only foundation. Like I mentioned, we have a pretty small staff. A typical foundation our size would have over 200 employees, and we have around 20. So we don't have time to take in a lot of requests for proposal and that kind of thing. We bring a real campaign mentality to our grant making. We don't necessarily fund ideas or pure science. We're very outcome driven, and we want to make sure that every grant we have is going to produce results. To do that, we partner with international, national, regional, local groups to protect areas, and of course, work with indigenous communities whenever possible. We have 3 main buckets of work here at the foundation in our conservation program. I'm going to focus mostly on the one in the upper right, the Wyss Campaign for Nature. We do still work in the U.S. As a percentage of our spending, about 50 to 60% in any given year we spend internationally on the Wyss Campaign for Nature, 35 to 45% on U.S. conservation, and then a very small 2 to 3% a year on global fisheries management, trying to get sustainable fisheries. And that work is really limited right now just in Canada, Mexico, and Peru. So as Rebecca mentioned, we are one of the leaders of the 30 by 30 movement. It was one of the 3, nature needs half Earth, and 30 by 30 that Rebecca talked about. Hans-Jörg announced the launch of the Wyss Campaign for Nature on October 31st, 2018, through an opinion piece in the New York Times, where he announced the 2 goals. He said he would spend $1 billion over the next 10 years pursuing 2 main goals. The first one is to convince world leaders to set a goal of protecting at least 30% of the planet by 2030 at the upcoming Convention on Biological Diversity, which I'll talk about in a second, as well as increasing our existing investments in specific projects all around the world. So we will and are scaling up our work on protected areas to more geographies. This is the slide where I normally have to say a bunch of really sobering statistics, but fortunately Rebecca covered all of that. So I think in a nutshell, it's pretty safe to say things are not going swimmingly when it comes to biodiversity conservation worldwide. One of the solutions, and I want to stress that one of the solutions to combating biodiversity loss is the creation of more protected areas. I'm not claiming that biodiversity conservation can be handled. The biodiversity crisis can be solved through protected areas alone. But what we do know is that it's the cornerstone of any truly serious effort at trying to combat the biodiversity crisis. Now, there are a lot of reasons to create new protected areas. It could be everything from just the aesthetic beauty of a place, such as Yosemite or the Grand Tetons. Another reason is for recreation, to protect recreational access that rural economies rely on. The lands may be sacred to the local indigenous population. They may contain outstanding examples of cultural resources. There's ecosystem services that flow from protected areas. We helped protect an area in the Tucumán province of Argentina, the sole purpose of which, the reason the government wanted to protect that area was to protect the water coming from the mountains where the protected area was created, because those mountain streams are absolutely vital to their agricultural economy, which is blueberries and lemons and strawberries. Obviously, as Rebecca mentioned, there's also carbon reasons to have new protected areas. Protect the integrity of a system that is intact keeps more carbon in the ground than one that has been fragmented. But from a biodiversity perspective, protected areas are the absolute cornerstone. If you look at any statistics, if you look at a marine protected area, the biomass within the protected area is 600 times higher than the biomass immediately adjacent to that area. If you also look at MPAs, the species diversity is 15% higher within a protected area compared to outside of that area. So that's just an example of why protected areas are so important. So the Wyss Campaign for Nature has two sort of interlocking goals that I mentioned that that Hans-Jörg had highlighted when launching the Wyss Campaign for Nature. And what we see is when we have new international targets, and this might sound strange to my American friends on the phone, but it's less strange to, I understand we have some folks from Mexico and from Canada that understand that countries actually take their international commitments very seriously. We have found in Canada, in the Andes Amazon countries, in Argentina, in Australia where we work, that the government is willing to protect more areas when they've made a commitment and they want to meet that commitment ahead of the next meeting. So as I'm going to discuss, we see the Convention on Biological Diversity that was supposed to be held in October of 2020 but has been delayed because of COVID as a real opportunity to increase global ambition as well on new protected areas, but as well to get new funding commitments from developed nations to help pay for protected areas in lesser developed countries. And I'll explain that in a little bit in more detail. That helps our work in countries that have adopted the CBD goals to actually protect new areas and to convince them to put money and funding into managing their protected areas. So I'll give a quick update on where things stand on the Convention on Biological Diversity process. As I mentioned, unfortunately, because of COVID, it has been delayed at least into 2021. There's, if you talk to anybody on any given day, it's either going to be in June of 2021 or maybe October 2021. We really think it needs to be in 2021. There was some discussion of moving it a full 2 years later, but hopefully that's been tamped down. But a lot of work is going into what the deal that's going to be agreed to at the Convention on Biological Diversity looks like. We've been pushing 30 by 30, and I want to make it very clear that we do not see the 30 by 30 goal as in conflict with half Earth or with nature needs half. The bottom line that all three movements agree on is we need more protected areas more quickly, and we need that to happen now. We see 30% by 2030 as a stepping stone to 50% or greater, as Rebecca mentioned, it may well require. There are 42 countries now that have publicly supported 30 by 30. There's a high ambition coalition for nature and people. These are groups who have agreed to lay in the tracks and say that no deal that they agree to will have targets that are less than 30 by 30, which is great. Most importantly, financing goals are now part of the Convention on Biological Diversity process. We're going to be coming out with a report. The Campaign for Nature will be coming out with a report in a few weeks that's going to show that the cost to reach 30 by 30 is going to be fairly staggering. Upwards of $100 billion per year needs to go into conservation in order to effectively manage that much land in a protected area state. But I think that it's worth putting some of that into context. So $100 billion a year or more is going to be needed. Every year, agribusiness globally is subsidized at over $700 billion a year. The oil and gas, the fossil fuel industries receives global subsidies equal to $5.3 trillion a year. The International Monetary Fund has estimated that ecosystem services, that's the clean water to clean air that flow from protected areas that we rely on, if we had to pay for that, it would be $125 trillion a year. So $100 billion a year to protect areas is not insane. It's actually quite reasonable if you look at it from an investment standpoint. I also want to mention that when we talk about 30 by 30, and Rebecca touched on this, we're not saying every single acre that makes up that 30% needs to be wilderness or a national park. The IUCN that Rebecca mentioned has 7 categories of protected area, all the way from a wilderness area that only scientific researchers can go into to things like conservation easements and working lands. And I understand that in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a follow-up presentation webinar in this series that's going to touch on working lands. So, and I'll touch on that of how we approach that kind of work here in a second. So now with the idea that we're striving to get the Convention on Biological Diversity to adopt a protected areas target of 30% of the earth by 2030 and putting in additional money. The second part of the Wyss Campaign for Nature, as I mentioned, is scaling up our work globally on the projects that we're funding. So right now we are working in Canada, Mexico, Barbados, Costa Rica, Suriname, Argentina, Mongolia, Spain, Romania, Namibia, Kenya, and Australia, where we're creating new protected areas. We're also in the big blue star in Southern Africa, Southeastern Africa. That is where we are funding better management of existing protected areas. And that work is in Kenya, Rwanda, Benin, Mozambique, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. The circles that are drawn on there are Wyss focal regions, and that's where we generally focus our work. With a small staff and $1 billion, $100 million a year sounds like a ton of money, but when you start actually implementing that money on the ground, you have to focus on where you want to work. So we develop these focal regions by looking both at the natural values of these areas, so the biodiversity, the wildness, the intactness of landscapes there, the opportunity to protect large areas. But we also looked at the political feasibility of actually protecting areas in these areas, so in these countries. So we looked at things like how secure land tenure is. We looked at the corruption index, the democracy index. How secure does the country have an existing national park service? How well managed is it? So we really focused on both of those things and weighed those against one another and came up with these focal regions. We do sometimes, as you can see, we have there are stars in Spain, Romania, and now Mongolia. We do experimental grants sometimes. Romania has been a longer standing priority for the foundation, but in Spain and Mongolia, we're doing trial grants to see whether or not we could have focal regions in the future in those areas. When we use three main strategies to help protect an area. One is advocacy. So where there is existing public land, we fund groups to advocate that local communities have identified, indigenous communities have identified as areas they want protected. If they come to us and we talk it through, we will provide funding for them to advocate to take the conservation management of that existing public land from whatever it is right now to a national park or a regional conservation area, municipal conservation area, etc. The second thing is buying land. So where there is not public land, we will buy land for one of two purposes. One is to fill in gaps or to connect existing public areas to one another so that there's connectivity between the protected areas. Secondly, in some cases, such as in Argentina, where there's very little public land, we actually have to buy the entire area and then get that area designated as a national park. And then the third strategy is using incentives. So sometimes the biggest impediment for a government to protect an area is simply that they lack the resources to manage the area after it's designated. In select cases like that, we will offer initial management and infrastructure funding contingent on the area being protected. So once it's been protected, then we provide the funding. So when we look at an individual project, when folks come to us and we reach out to them, we look at 6 main criteria. Number one, the area has to be large, wild, and interconnected and intact, at least relevant relative to its context. Number two, the protections being sought must be legally permanent and enduring. We take very much a belt and suspenders approach and ensure that our investments will result in permanent conservation as opposed to simply like land use planning or something like that could be undone in the future. The third thing is we look at sort of the feasibility. Is near to midterm success politically feasible? The next is We love it when we have an opportunity to partner with other philanthropic organizations or the government so that the Wyss Foundation is not 100% of the money into any one project. We love to leverage our funding with other public and private funding. The fifth one is engaging good partners. We do a lot of due diligence around the financial health of an organization, making sure that they can actually accomplish what they're asking us to fund. And then finally, that we have an exit strategy and that we're not stuck in a project for 20, 30 years. We hope to get areas protected, 2, 3, 5 years at the most. So how successful have we been since 1998? We've protected about 53.5 million acres. That is roughly the size of the state of Idaho or the country of Romania. As you can see, about 42% of that has been here in the United States, with the rest of it internationally. Rebecca had touched on the various IUCN categories. If you look at this pie chart in the upper left there, you can see that over half of the lands that we've protected have national park or higher protections. About 25% have protection that would be equal to, say, a BLM national monument or a BLM, Bureau of Land Management national conservation area here in the United States. And then the balance of that is in that category of public or private lands that have some additional protection on them. And sometimes some of the lands that make up that 23% are in a holding pattern currently and will eventually go into one of the other three categories when the government's able to accept the land and designate the area. I'm going to talk very briefly about the 30 by 30, the nascent 30 by 30 effort here in the United States. I wear two different hats sometimes, so I've been talking to you about the Wyss Campaign for Nature and my work at the Wyss Foundation. I'm also a board member of the Conservation Lands Foundation, and they're one of 180 groups that have formed a coalition that said, okay, the United States is not party to the Convention on Biological Diversity, so a 30 by 30 target that is adopted as the Convention on Biological Diversity is not necessarily applicable to the United States. But they looked at what was going on and all the energy around the 30 by 30 effort and said the United States ought to have its own national policy of protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. To put it into context, we're at about 12% right now of our land is protected and 26% of our oceans. The problem with our ocean protections right now is that most of them are in very remote areas that are not necessarily the most productive from a fishery standpoint. And so less than 1% of the land, or the ocean rather, close to the continental United States is still unprotected. There are 3030 resolutions that have been introduced in the House by Congresswoman Deb Haaland out of New Mexico, and then my senator, Michael Bennett, as well as Tom Udall, have introduced a 30 by 30 resolution in the Senate. So this effort is already seeing some real oomph behind it, which is great. There's also some state level bills that have been introduced in South Carolina and California, and serendipitously, the California bill happens to be Assembly Bill 3030, which is pretty cool. It's also been included in the Biden campaign platform, and prior to Vice President Biden becoming the presumptive nominee, it was actually in all of the major Democratic Party presidential campaigns. There was recently a poll, everybody here, I'm sure, is aware of the Conservation in the West poll that Colorado College does every year, and 30 by 30 polled that 73% of voters support 30 by 30. Finally, I would just say, if you're interested in this from the United States context, there's a website, natureamerica.org, that has all of the information and contact information that you could ever imagine. One thing I'll point out is that approximately 60% of the lands in the continental United States are in a mostly natural condition. So a 30 by 30 is not a crazy and unreachable goal for the United States. Finally, there's tons of resources out there about 30 by 30. The WyssCampaign.org snapshot of that website showing. You can look at all of the various projects that I was showing on that map. The campaign for nature.org is sort of the 30 by 30 site. That's a collaboration between the Wyss Foundation and National Geographic Society. It's a very dense website, but it's got more information than you could ever want or desire about 30 by 30, all the science behind why 30 by 30 is important. So I encourage you to check that out. If you're just curious about the Wyss Foundation, there's some a website in our social media. And with that, I guess I will turn it back to Dominique.
Thank you so much, Heath. That was a great add-on to Rebecca, and thank you so much for sharing all the work that you all are doing on this campaign. So excited, and I know we have a lot of questions that we're going to get to, so we'll get to as many as we possibly can. If you'd like to submit a question, just use that question box in the GoToWebinar control panel. I will show my webcam. I know we were having some technical difficulties earlier, but Rebecca, if we can see you and Heath, then great, and if not, we at least have the slide with your beautiful faces. So with that, a question to get us started from the audience here. So this question is a little bit, touches on something you've both covered, which is that there are different categories of protected spaces, and you probably will need to use many of them to get anywhere close to these goals. And so Rebecca, maybe starting with you, and then Heath, would love to have you add on, how do you think about prioritizing what sorts of places to protect? Do you start with what's already available? Do you think about ecological restoration, or do you kind of go for the gold, national park status or something above that? Rebecca, would love to hear your perspective, and then Heath, anything to add would be great.
Yeah, there are officially, but even more, 6 categories of protection. Category 1 is the most protected, where it's considered protected pristine without much human influence or management. And then the category 6, which is managed for multiple uses. So you can think of BLM lands or Forest Service lands as being protected areas as well. So you can imagine when there's that degree of differences in the way they use, you can get very different things out of lands and waters when you manage them very differently. I think one of the things that the science is telling us is that we need to be more systematically focused on how we're managing all our lands and waters in categories 1 through 6, and not seeing anything as throwaway anymore. We certainly have so many degraded lands now that are candidates for restoration, and we must restore them if we're going to continue the full array of ecosystem services that we depend on, not the least of which is food production for our growing population at a global stage. One thing I didn't talk about is that WWF has also used these priorities as sort of a systematic way of prioritizing big landscapes like Heath. In the Wyss Foundation, we are in a race to protect what's left, to make sure that we can hold on to biodiversity and the diverse array of life on the planet. But at the same time, we need to be shifting our thinking and embracing more of the community around the globe that's thinking about restoring degraded lands for food production, so that we don't need to be cutting down primary forest or primary grasslands to grow food. And it's really important that we think about all of the land as activated for the array of kind of conservation outcomes we need, category 1 through 6. And then also look at this other category, which is indigenous and local community lands and private lands, which really add value to the overall array of the benefits we want from natural lands and natural waters. To look at, are we healthy? Do we have a healthy planet? Are humans across the globe actually thriving in the places where they live? And how can we change our management of lands and waters and the air in order to make sure that people can be healthy?
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer, Rebecca, and I so appreciate that there are no throwaway lands.
There are no
restoration
throwaways.
piece.
No, exactly.
Seems very important. Heath, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is, yeah, and the difference between 6 and 7, just real quick, there's 1A and 1B, and so I always say 7, but Rebecca's right, it's actually 6. What I would say is that nobody's ever said it was a bad idea to protect an area. There's that old parable of the starfish are all laying on the beach and the kid throws one back in, and what's the point of it? What was the point of throwing that one back in? The rest of them are going to die, and the kid says it mattered to that one. So the areas that are protected are important for biodiversity, even if it's not the most biodiverse area. And like I said, you have to constantly weigh the political feasibility of getting an area protected, and that also applies to which of those 6 categories it's going to be in, is what's politically feasible against what we need to protect the most important areas. So you could spend, Hanser could spend his entire half of the money that he's pledged to the Gates Pledge on trying to protect the most biodiverse area, but if there's no possibility of ever getting it protected through the political process that has to be done, what would be the benefit, cost benefit of that for all the areas that maybe aren't the most important, but they're still very important to the species that live there and to the people who want to see those lands protected.
And I'll just, if I can just add,
Yes, please.
No, it's just to say that political structures, governance structures, cultural, the culture changes so much from landscape to seascape to landscape across. So we are working in the U.S., but we're also working in Namibia, and we're also working in the Amazon, and we're also working in Indonesia. Every single one of those places and those contexts offers a different kind of opportunity for protecting and managing resources better. And we can't do in Indonesia a lot of the things we can do here in the US, but that doesn't mean there aren't other really important opportunities to get production and good management in categories 1 through 6. And so we really look across the range of how we can get as much done as possible where we are working.
Yes, that place context seems so important, and was so interested and glad to see both of you talk a little bit about your work with Indigenous communities as well, and thinking about managed lands on Indigenous owned lands. Another question here that seems very important is kind of the role of connectivity. And I think, Rebecca, maybe you touched just very briefly on the idea that land that is connected, larger landscapes, et cetera, will have a broader and more diverse biosphere, locally, but that there is a need and desire to try and connect protected lands, that there's additive benefits there. It's not always possible. How do you think about that? Maybe Heath, you want to start, and then Rebecca would love to have you add.
Sure. Yeah, great. It's a great question. Connectivity is super important. Rebecca showed how conservation has changed over time to now a discussion of connectivity. It's actually a great tie into your upcoming webinar. We, in that category that I showed, that was OECMs in category 6, conservation easements make up a not insignificant portion of that for the lands that we've helped to protect. Politically, you're not just going to condemn private land and say now it's a protected area, but kind of following on what Rebecca was just saying, you can work with landowners to ensure that the lands that are those important connectivity areas between 2 protected areas. A great example is in the upper green of Wyoming, where we've partnered with the Conservation Fund to help fund easements along with the federal government, the NRCS, to protect an important migratory corridor for pronghorn and for mule deer between the Bridger Teton and the withdrawn Wyoming range. So yeah, I mean, the connectivity is absolutely critical if we're going to protect species in addition to just establishing new protected areas.
Yeah,
Rebecca, please.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that the really interesting thing, it's you can protect an area by buying it or getting easements or getting a lease or a right of way. Lots of things you can do. One of the most exciting projects in connectivity that I've seen on the globe connects Angola, Namibia, Zambia, and Botswana in this region we call Kaza. And it's called Kaza because it connects these major rivers and migrations like you've never seen in your life of elephants and giraffes and zebras and you name it. And if we had the kind of patchwork there that we have other places, we would lose these massive migrations. But what they came together in this Kaza transboundary conservation effort is that they have community after community that owns a stake in that migration. They owns the opportunity for tourism, for people to come in and see that migration. And because they have a stake in that migration and those animals flowing through their lands, they steward those migrations as they come through and benefit from them. So some lands are protected in there. Mostly the local communities have a financial and economic and cultural stake in maintaining those migrations. So that's a way in which protected areas and these other kind of legal agreements of benefit sharing can actually deliver very, very large, not just landscape, but regional scale conservation that's critically important for species protection, for habitat protection, and for good economic livelihoods.
And actually, if I can just jump in really quick.
Please.
We actually just recently released a report that you can find on the WyssCampaign.org website, looking at 4 different projects that we funded with local and indigenous communities. And one of the ones that's highlighted in there is our work with the Northern Rangelands Trust, which is a community-based conservancy effort to create conservation conservancies between protected areas in Kenya. And that's another great example. They lack maybe the legal protections to make, they would be an OECM, other effective conservation measure, but it's the best you can do there at the time, and it's making a huge difference in the communities benefiting from tourism, obviously down right now during COVID, but that'll spring back. So yeah, lots of great examples like that all over the world, and we need to scale that up. That's part of the Wyss Campaign for Nature, scaling up that kind of work.
It sounds like that tie to the local economic needs and having that resilient economic piece as well is so important, and obviously big for community buy-in and trust as well. I can't believe how quickly the time is going. We're going to do one more very quick question, and then want to talk briefly about some upcoming webinars that Heath has mentioned. Lastly, we have a couple different questions about water. And obviously water resources are so important for any given area. And, in many places, water, just because there's water nearby doesn't mean an area has access to it. How do you think about making sure that the site that you work to protect and maybe invest in is going to have adequate water resources? Heath, any quick notes on that? And Rebecca, would love to hear your perspective as well.
Sure. I think the best example, like the most salient example, is I mentioned in my presentation in Tucumán. With Aconquilla. So there is a glacier and some mountains, the Aconquilla Mountains, and the government came to us and actually said, we need to buy a bunch of land here from willing sellers, create a national park for the sole purpose of protecting this water resource. So whatever the reason might be that a government wants to protect an area, we're open. We love to hear why, and if water is the driving force, happy to help.
Yeah, and I'll just say,
Rebecca, any last notes?
Just one of the important things about really looking at the landscape scale is water often gets forgotten, but it is a critical component of the landscape and the resources that both nature and people need, and a real focus, particularly in the context of climate change, on ensuring the longevity of those resources to all of those needs is really important. We know it is getting really, really tough, and it's one of those things that we will all have to be focused on, protecting and managing lands, waters, and both freshwater and marine moving forward.
Well, I cannot thank you both enough for your wisdom and all that you shared today. As Heath mentioned, we will be following up on this topic in 2 weeks. On June 18th, we will have a webinar about working lands and the role of working lands in efforts like 30 by 30 and large landscape conservation. So we'll get to talk a little bit more about that on that day, that is June 18th. Next week, I want to let you know we will be having a webinar on equitable access to nature. We have two great panelists, Benita Hussein from the 10-Minute Walk campaign at the Trust for Public Land, and Dr. Scott Sampson, who is at the California Academy of Sciences and the author of How to Raise a Wild Child. Very excited about that topic. I think particularly relevant for so many who have been cooped up at home during this time of the pandemic. With that, I want to thank you both, Rebecca Shaw and Heath Nero, for joining us from your homes today. Thank you for everything you shared. Thank you all for joining and your great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but appreciate it. And everyone be safe and be healthy and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.